So I'm Herschel Naklis from the Rockefeller Center and the Department of Government here, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Paul Frymer to Dartmouth. Paul's a professor of politics and director of the program in law and public affairs at Princeton. As most of you know, neither Dartmouth nor Princeton has a law school, but Paul runs the closest thing that Princeton has to a law school. It's really the hub of law at that university. He's the author of 3 important books, which he just told me not to summarize in any detail, but I highly encourage all of you to read all 3 of them, in addition to the one that he'll talk about today. His first book, Uneasy Alliances, Race and Party Competition in America, is a fantastic study of that issue and really brought the idea of captured groups of minority voters, I think, to political scientists. His second book, Black and Blue, African Americans, the Labor Movement, and the Decline of the Democratic Party, and 2 related and I think now classic articles in the American Political Science Review show how the Democratic Party wrestled both successfully and unsuccessfully with 2 of its major constituencies over the course of the 20th century, civil rights and economic rights, and how working sort of on both of those separately really ended up hurting the party and really hurting one of those issues. His third book, about which he'll speak today, came out I think literally a week ago, Building an American Empire, the Era of Territorial and Political Expansion. It's worth noting that this book has already been said to remap large parts of American history. It's been called a profound achievement in the study of the American state formation. It's been called bracingly revisionist and a foundational work. So with that, please join me in welcoming Paul to Dartmouth.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks, Herschel, for the great introduction. I really appreciate it. The 3 books, as Herschel mentioned, all have different topics. They're all in different time periods. This is my first effort into the 18th and 19th century. But they all deal with actually pretty similar themes. The first being me, that I write them, and so I have the same thoughts in my head as go throughout. But they're all about, broadly, questions of political institutions, the way political institutions are used to construct public policies, and the way that these policies have consequences for questions such as inequality, such as racial formation, or racial inequality, putting the 2 together. So the themes of my work are the same, and even though here I'm in a different century and in a different geography, the questions that I'm asking are the questions that have stuck in my head for quite a while. So let's talk about American expansion. And this is a map that we all know, we hope. This is the United States, the 48 contiguous states, and the speed at which American expansion occurred. The United States expanded from 13 colonies to what is now sea to shining sea, 48 states, quite quickly. The United States, in sort of the grand moments here, began after the American Revolutionary War with the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain. That treaty gave us all of the land, almost all of the land, to the Mississippi River. Then, seemingly by accident, the United States acquired, through the Louisiana Purchase from France, from Napoleon, a huge swath of land that extended all the way from New Orleans up into Idaho. And then probably the third biggest piece of this is the war with Mexico that brought about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and land, depending on who you talk to, Texas is very controversial here, but land extending from, in some ways, Texas all the way through California. So this is a map we well know. It's a period of American history that we're all familiar with, and it's one that is fairly uncomplicated, or at least and particularly uncomplicated by politics. When we tend to think about American expansion, this quote by Alexis de Tocqueville nicely summarizes it. We think of American expansion based on fortune, based on pluck and luck to a certain degree. The Louisiana Purchase, a perfect example of that, the luck of getting all this land so quickly. The sense that we, as Tocqueville says, we're in the midst of a wilderness where we could almost say that we have no neighbors. We didn't need to fight the big battles that Western Europe and Asia and Africa seemed to fight in order to grab this massive amount of land. And so there's an apolitical sense in which we understand it. There's also a sense in which, as a political scientist, when I first started talking about this as a topic and why is it that no one really studies this as a topic, the answer quickly was, well, it's an N of one. N of one meaning it's a case study. It's one event, the expansion of the United States, and how it seems exceptional to the rest of the world. It seems uninteresting for broader implications. So let me give you a series of maps here. And one of the first things I want to say is that it's not an N of one. There's actually many different pieces of American expansion. It's not seamless. It's not organic. It isn't just a swift move from the east to west with a seemingly understandable resting spot, the Pacific Ocean, and an understandable resting spot to the southern and northern borders, but actually a quite complicated process that has many pieces. So here's the first sense. In 1790, these are the boundaries of the United States. It's based on the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Again, as I mentioned before, this was to end the American Revolutionary War, the treaty with the British, which gave the United States land all the way to the Mississippi River. Now notice here right away something that is striking and something that I deal with throughout the book, and that is the difference between declarations of sovereignty and control of land to a certain border and the actual incorporation of that land, or the possession of that land, the ownership of that land. The United States here declares sovereignty via this Treaty of Paris with Great Britain all the way to the Mississippi River. But as of 7 years after that Treaty of Paris, by 1790, still more than half of this land was unoccupied by the United States. There was still much to be done in terms of the settlement of this, in terms of the removal of populations that existed there at the time, and the securing of this land and making it part of the United States. Here's a more dramatic example. This is the state of Georgia in 1790. As you see, the county, these are U.S. counties on my right. Is that, I guess, your left? No, your right. Sorry. And as you see, much of Georgian expansion was stifled by the large amounts of land owned by Native Americans, Cherokees, Creek, Chippewas, and so forth. I should say all of these Indian nations, none of which were parties to the Treaty of Paris. So when the Treaty of Paris of 1783 was announced, none of these nations had any idea that their land was taken from them and given by sovereignty to the United States. But again, declarations of sovereignty doesn't mean actual incorporation. The incorporation of the United States takes a great deal of time. In 1820, as we see, the United States starts to move west in a certain way. Note here also a theme, and I'm going to highlight this as I move along, but there's a managed way in which this expansion, in which this incorporation takes place, and it tends to move concretely and systematically, as opposed to moving in patches in the ways that alternatives might see, which we'll give some examples of. Here, by 1820, the United States had expanded almost to the Mississippi River. You see the patches there at the bottom. That's still the battles with Native American nations to the south, and which will become huge battles in the 1830s and 1840s, but a certain process here. 1830, we see further expansion. 1840 now, this is after Indian removal, the Indian removal policy of 1830, and now in the Trail of Tears, and really now almost a full incorporation to the Mississippi River. Extending on, 1860, we see now the United States for the first time starts to move west beyond the Mississippi River in sizable ways, gathering California and Oregon quickly after the war with Mexico, but still much of the nation open to incorporation, open in need of settlement. Even when we go to 1900, maybe this doesn't surprise you, but it does surprise me. At least when I first looked at it. Here in 1900 now, 45 of the U.S. states have been incorporated. 3 remain. And it's interesting to think of which 3 these are: Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona. They're not accidental to the story that I'm about to tell, and they say something about the way in which American expansion and the understanding of American empire takes place. And then this is also a map which I created, and it's not an ideal map, but this is there were many different ways in which the United States perceived what its empire would look like. Again, when I said in the beginning about false starts and alternatives not taken, Thomas Jefferson, when he talked about an empire of liberty, he thought the empire of liberty would extend all the way to the bottom of Argentina, or today's Argentina. Many people who thought about manifest destiny thought about the U.S. capital eventually residing in Mexico City or even Rio, Brazil. So the United States had very broad ideas of what expansion, what empire might possibly mean. The shaded areas here, especially to the south, and note here not Canada, these are areas of the region in which the United States Congress and executive branch thought that the land was available for acquisition. So whether it was truly available for acquisition is a separate question, and I'm not going to answer it. What I'm looking at here are moments when Congress and the president debated whether to take land they thought was available to them, and they turned it down. That's the key. They turned it down. So the United States, we had many people who thought about taking Canada. We had many people who thought about going, well into South America. But there were never moments where Congress and the president turned down what they thought was an opportunity for this land. We fought a war to try to take Canada, actually on a couple of different times in different ways. We never succeeded. We never turned down Canadian land. So here are some of the places that we have turned down. Mexico. The United States, during the war with Mexico, had troops in Mexico City. All of Mexico was potentially open to debate and the possibility of entering the United States. The U.S. was very, very clear in the way in which it carved out the land that it did. We included here Cuba. I think Cuba is an interesting one because you see how big Cuba is and how close it is to Florida. And from George Washington, Thomas Jefferson on, Cuba was always thought to be necessarily part of the United States because of its proximity. And yet, we're all probably familiar with the 1890s, or if not, we're familiar with the Fidel Castro years of the 1950s and 60s and the various attempts by the U.S. to grab Cuba. But for my interests, the 1820s, and again in the 1850s were both moments where the U.S. believed Cuba was there for the taking, not by armed insurgency, but that Cuba was being offered to the United States by the Spanish Empire, and we turned it down in both cases. So again, fitting within the story. What all of this suggests is that when we start to look at expansion as a whole, we need to break it up into different pieces, and we need to see different things that are at work. These colors just give you kind of a sense at which I tried to divide up this obviously large mass of territory and try to make sense of it. Starting with the red 13 colonies, the blue incorporation of states up to the Mississippi River and the Treaty of Paris. The yellow states, which, as you'll see if you can read the number, oh yeah, it's actually a lot bigger up there than it is here. Many of these states coming after the Civil War. Many of these are homestead states. Many of these are states that were part of the post-Abraham Lincoln Republican Party when they're carving up the West. So I look at them as a bit of a piece. And then the green states to the south, the southwest, of which Texas through California. These are areas controlled primarily or previously by the Spanish Empire and Mexico after 1821. And then other places, the orangish red, of which the U.S. debates and thinks about debating. Let me say here that I won't belabor you with the research method per se, but I will say for those historians in the room or potential historians or people who are just good at looking up Wikipedia, I don't just, there is a method to this madness. I try to use a research project that doesn't look at everything. My goal is not to explain everything. My goal is to try to explain essentially here the way in which the United States moves from open territory to incorporated territory. And what I mean by that, for purposes of definition, is from territory to statehood. So that's my interest here, and that's why the dates of statehood are important, is to explain this process by which these territories become states, or in certain contexts, like Cuba, Mexico, these potential territories never become states. Note here, there's a great deal of variation before I move on. Some states become states within a year. Some states, you'll note the yellow West Virginia there in the middle, are carved out of other states. I think Vermont is another one, as is Maine, are carved out from other places. Massachusetts, Georgia, Virginia, Connecticut, they all claimed land, some to the Mississippi River, some to the Pacific Ocean. So there was some carving out. And some, California is another, that was a territory very, very briefly. There's also one state west of the Mississippi that was never a territory. Anyone know what it was? The great state of Texas. There's no Texans here. They would scream that, because I've been screamed at that about that. Because there is an argument that Texas came in as a separate country. But Texas actually, to this day, and in a lot of the story that I'm going to tell, Texas doesn't fit in certain ways because it never was a territory. But the rest are territories. They start as territories, and some go up to the lengthiest being New Mexico and Arizona, over 60 years as territories. Okay, this sums up kind of the question, the problem, the intermediary, and the solution that I argue throughout the book. And I'm going to just lay this out quickly, then I'll give you a few examples, and then we'll wrap up. All right, so expansion. As opposed to, as the Tocqueville quote, as opposed to our earlier sense of the seamlessness, the organicness of American expansion, expansion raised two problems. The first is that it means a constant confrontation with people. There are places where the United States moved where there were no people, or at least there were acres, maybe even broader spaces. But by and large, the United States confronted people. Hundreds of that, by the federal government's estimates, over 600,000 Native Americans in its earliest years, more as they moved further west. About 50,000 French in Louisiana when the United States took the Louisiana Purchase. Hundreds of thousands of Mexican citizens. Potentially hundreds of thousands of Cubans. Potentially hundreds of thousands throughout the surrounding areas that the United States confronted and had to face. This also includes Spanish, this includes French, this includes British. At every move, there is a confrontation with people. Second, the United States, as we've seen in those maps, had large, exposed, and unsecure territorial peripheries. And as a state builder, to form a nation, that's obviously terrifying to people. It should be terrifying to people, and it helps to know that it was terrifying to people. It was terrifying to George Washington. It was terrifying to Thomas Jefferson. It was terrifying to Henry Knox, in charge of the Department of War. So this was a constant issue of how to deal with the territorial peripheries. It's kind of an interesting thing if those of you familiar with Frederick Jackson Turner, and who isn't. Frederick Jackson Turner argued, infamously, because it's been contested in a lot of ways, but the excitement of the frontier. The frontier was where American values were formed. The frontier was an exciting place of American evolution. In reality, this was a terrifying place, at least for American state builders. They constantly feared that it would either go to another country, that it would break apart from the United States and form its own country, or that it was just a place of lawlessness and a place that would lead to war, whether it was war with Native Americans, whether it was war with hovering European empires, whether it was war with American settlers. This was a terrifying place. So those are the problems. There were two intermediaries here. One was domestic racial politics. So the United States is confronting lots of different people. As we all know, as scholars of race, race is an artificial construct in terms of what it means for our political behavior and what it means for us as citizens. It is something that changes over time. It is something that evolves with different politics, different histories, and different understandings of the meaning. Within this, the United States debated extensively what it meant to be an American. And recognize here too, American is not American 2017. American in 1790 is a lot of people from England, some people from Germany, some people from France, some people who are part or mostly indigenous, all kind of figuring out what that is. Is it just a brand new company? Is it something that is actually meaningful? Is it something different than the British? Right? So this idea of the making of a people matters, and domestic racial politics plays a critical role. What I found here, and I don't want to underestimate actually how expansive it was, both North, South, abolitionist, pro-slavery. Americans saw themselves as a white nation. And by a white nation, I mean they use the word white over and over and over. There's no need for me here to dissect or deny, and I'll have some examples to show it, just a few. It was very explicit, from Thomas Jefferson to Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt. The United States was a white nation. And one of the things we don't realize is how dominant this was. In the midst of this, there are huge fights about race. Slavery is a huge fight about race. But here, and I'm not going to talk about too much today, but in the book, what we have is a South that supports slavery, a North that opposes slavery, but both were quite strongly, emphatically in favor of a white settler nation. To give you just one example of many that clarifies this, the state of Oregon, in its constitution, prohibited slavery. It was part of the abolitionist movement. On the same day of this constitution that prohibited slavery, 80% of its voters voted that it banned people of African descent from entering its borders. Right? So, abolitionist or not, a strong sense of a white settler nation. Now, there are lots of footnotes to this and lots of debates of what whiteness meant. Did it mean the Spanish, for instance, which is a huge debate? Did it mean early on the French, Catholic, often they had a different sense of law, not a sense of law, a different procedure of law, civil law versus our common law, many different language and so forth. Throughout this, the United States debates what it means to be white, and it's never entirely clear, but there's a strong sense that they know it when they see it. Okay, and then the other intermediary is the nation, the United States, as I mentioned earlier, is expanding in its power over time. It starts quite weak. It ends quite strong, at least in the sense of it's a hegemon in the area. But early on, really up at least to the 1830s, 1840s, it's the United States, a new nation, getting started, and the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, and Native American nations that have military support, and this is by all accounts in the government documents, far larger than what the United States had. So that's early. Later, the United States sees itself much more dominant, and it's going to act differently throughout the process. All right. So then the final, and this is the focus really where the book moves around, is land policy. The use of this managed settlement to secure borders when the United States is weak, and engineer demographics in a manner that defends this domestic racial politics of a white settler state. So that's the dominant theme of the book, is the use of this land policy to solve these problems and these intermediaries to bring about a white state that is secure and engineered. All right, let me give you now some examples. But first, actually, before I give you examples, why land policy? Why come up with this policy piece in seemingly an expansion that involves violence, that does involve military action, and so forth. And first to say, land policy is a huge piece of this period. Henry Clay, he's the McConnell of the 1820s and 30s, or the Paul Ryan maybe. But he, as he says throughout this process, land is what the United States Congress and what the United States government fought about throughout this period. Because land is what the United States had, and land is what the United States was distributing, and land is what the United States was fighting over. And as Thomas Jefferson says, this is how the United States forms. Repeated proofs of purchases made in their most unexceptional form. Now, this makes sense if we are understanding of Lockean senses of democracy. Property rights is a critical piece of individualism. But there's also another reason why land policy was so important When you think about the United States at the time of the Constitution, what does everyone say about the central government in the United States in this period? It's weak. Who's strong? The states, right? The battle is between the states and the federal government, and the states are powerful. And the long 19th into all the way to the New Deal is a fight between the central government trying to gain power from the states. It's a fight that we're still having today. But certainly, whether it's the Articles of Confederation or whether it's the Constitution, states had the dominant power at this time period. What was the one thing the federal government had a lot more power over? You go on and on with possibilities. It's land, and it's land to the west. All of this unincorporated land is not in states. So while states dominated their borders and dominated the possibilities in their borders, the federal government dominated the territories. And this is a lot of land. Here, more than half. And as such, this is a place where the federal government could say who the elected officials would be, what the electoral process would look like, what the economic development would look like, what the military situation would look like. The US government was the dominant entity in this area. So here and here. This is a lot of land. Most land is territory, and the US government is dominant here. So that's why land policy is the way in which the US manufactures this process. This is what it has power over, and it uses it for a lot of different purposes. I'm not going to get into nearly all of them by any means, but here is a place where the US government is powerful. Okay, so let me give you some examples of how the US uses this policy. And actually, as I do this, let me do a quick caveat. I'm giving a 40-ish minute talk on a big period over a lot of time. So caveat one is footnote, 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 footnote. There's tons of it. And the messiness is in the book. Hopefully it's well captured. There's lots of failures. What a 40-minute talk tends to over-exaggerate is the seemingly strategic, conventional understanding that this is all just a project that we perfectly put everyone into different pieces. It didn't work that way. There were lots of disagreements over what was going on. There were lots of disagreements over land policy. There were lots of disagreements over whether we should expand, what kind of expansion should take place. That's a caveat. I'm happy to talk more about it. And if you are interested, it's all in the book, or at least as much messiness without losing a main thread is in the book. I keep the main thread because I hope in the book to convince you how big and dominant this managerial process is over a quite messy situation, a situation that we usually think of as just entirely messy, but to see that actually, no, there's something interesting here, I hope something interesting. Okay. Okay, so let's get a sense then of some of the ways in which the U.S. used land policy. First, early on, when the U.S. is at its weakest, it used land policy to bound its borders. And by this, what I mean is not to expand, but the U.S. recognized that it was weak. Washington recognized the country was weak. Jefferson recognized the country was weak. Knox recognized the country was weak. Hamilton, and so forth. And so what they did is they used boundaries, by which I mean land policies, and actually they get it from the British. This is the proclamation of 1763 that the British impose. What these land policies do is they say the United States, or the British Empire prior to it, has all the land up to the boundary. Outside of the boundary, you as an American citizen or as a part of the British Empire are not allowed to go. If you do go, you go into lawless land. You have no rights to that land. If you acquire the land on your own via some type of land deal that you make, it is not good in American courts. It is not legal. And so this is a boundary. It isn't a perfect boundary. Lots of people do move. You might remember those early maps of Kentucky being the first state that goes west, and that's because Kentucky is honestly a free-for-all. It's where this fails. Very early on, Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, and others, the boundary fails in Kentucky, partly geographically because of the Cumberland Gap, partly because there's a smaller Native American population there to oppose. But anyway, there's a myriad of reasons here. This doesn't always work, but there's a power to it, and we're going to see it in terms of the settlement practices and maps. So the British start this idea. They do this in 1763 because they were losing wars, and they decided they can't defend the whole area of territory, so they're only going to defend a part, and they're going to bound and keep their people within this part. in 1775, 1776, U.S. populations fit this initial British proclamation. It worked. Again, with the exception of populations moving into Kentucky, by and large, this worked. And here in 1790, once the U.S., you see the line there, that is the British proclamation, and you see Kentucky and a little bit of Tennessee, but by and large, this still holds. Now, almost 30 years after the British proclamation, these boundaries kept settlements, kept incorporated settlements, fairly well managed. So these settlement patterns and movements are backed up then by a set of policies. And I won't get into the details of the policies, but the land ordinances, the Northwest Ordinance is probably the most famous of 1787. What all of these do is control and keep people within boundaries, and it controls the distribution. And they use all sorts of seemingly boring, technical, arcane things, surveys, by demanding, for instance, that if somebody is going to purchase land, it has to be surveyed by a government official before they can purchase that land. That controls the pace of this development. You have to wait for the surveyor. And again, if you purchase land before it is surveyed, it's not yours. It can never be yours. So it's the U.S. attempting to control this. Grids, and here's one example of a grid, another example of a grid. We have hundreds and hundreds of grids. San Francisco is a grid. The Midwest is a grid. These were designed, again, in part, to do two things. I'm sorry, I'm going back here. Part to control the process of moving forward. In part to, as Henry Knox said, condense instead of disperse. One of the things that a grid does is it puts people in a small parcel of land. The idea being keep people concentrated, close together, as opposed to roaming out wherever they want and finding as much land as they can. And recognize a lot of people wanted that. They wanted to, America was a land of opportunity. So they wanted to roam out and get as much land as possible. What the government was doing is keeping them within their grids, keeping them condensed. As Thomas Jefferson said, and these are quotes from Jefferson when the United States acquired the Louisiana Purchase. He said about the Louisiana Purchase, that's not for us to settle. In fact, what he thought of with the Louisiana Purchase initially is that it would be where Native Americans would be moved to. It begins the process of Indian removal, is the Louisiana Purchase, because now there is a place to take or forcibly remove and send the Cherokees, the Creek, and others across the Mississippi River. But for the United States expansion, instead, the goal was full on this side. Let's pack this side with population, advance compactly as we multiply. Pile this side with population, and then we move forward. And if you remember those maps earlier on, that's what we were seeing, the slow movement of settlement across time. Note here, too, how this works in terms of security. Piling grids of settlements of people on top of those that we feel are a danger to us. In this case, the Choctaw Indians. This is in Alabama. All of this is designed to avoid war, and that is because the U.S. has small militaries this time. It uses land purchases and land settlement as a way to avoid it. These are the military personnel at the time. In the 1780s and 90s, our number of troops that were not volunteers were in the hundreds. They then moved into the thousands, the low thousands. They hovered typically around 6,000, 7,000. You'll notice the spikes around the War of 1812. That's mostly volunteers that are coming in for those moments, as well as the war with Mexico. But in general, a small military, and one that they recognized and talked about as being far smaller, not just with the British, the Spanish, and the French, but with Native Americans, of which they talked constantly. Probably were wrong. They were probably exaggerated in their understanding of this. But they thought Native American nations could mobilize 300,000 troops to fight the United States. That was the number that was said repeatedly, 300,000. Again, it's an exaggeration, but if you think of why an exaggeration, think of today and the way in which we think about military threats. We tend to exaggerate because we're fearful in that. But certainly a strong belief that we were outnumbered, outgunned. Instead, we used land. We purchased land from Native Americans as a way to try to avoid this type of potential military battle. We also used what they called residence and defense. We gave land to people who were in the military as bounties. This was designed, one, to basically pay for their military service, but two, to put people who were soldiers in key land areas so that they would defend the territory themselves. So you see here, these are military bounty lands. This is in the early 1800s. They're on the frontier. They put them there in the place that is most insecure, where these soldiers can, again, be rewarded for their war efforts, but also they can help defend when the battle takes place. Ohio is the most dramatic example of that. Ohio is basically military bounty land, and it was carved out specifically, and the generals and the troops were put there by George Washington because this was seen as the critical place in which the United States needed to move forward, and so it carved out these districts to put ex-military officials so that they could defend against the next battle. It's Ohio that has some of the biggest battles of the 1790s, both won and lost, and it's Ohio that kind of secures the movement forward. Another example with Illinois. I don't know if you can really see this, but this is a map of the time, and what you do see again is a sense that if you can read all those names on the left, the United States did not see itself, certainly the military did not see itself as settling an empty nation. It saw itself as settling a nation surrounded by Native Americans. That's how they perceive themselves, and that's how they move forward. I mentioned armed occupation. This is another example in Fort Luther. Oops, that's my shoulder on the mic. Sorry about that. I should have used the lapel. I'm back in place. During the Seminole War, which was the Vietnam of the 1830s and 1840s, the Armed Occupation Act was used to, again, provide land, 160 acres of land, free land, if you owned a gun and if you lived within a very small territory, of which they, again, through grids and surveys, put people in compact places. These were right in the spots of the hottest conflicts of the Seminole War, and they were effective. They moved a lot of people into Florida in a very quick period of time, and by the accounts of the period, seemingly ended the Seminole War in really not even just a matter of years, but a matter of months. Oregon had a similar one. The past one of Florida was the Armed Occupation Act of 1842, the Oregon Donation Act of 1850. You see the language here. The Army of Occupation. This is to use settlers, again, with guns to grab and hold land. Okay, so that's the first, securing. The second, my second of two examples that I'm giving you today, is using these land policies for racial engineering. As I've said before, whiteness is a dominant theme of the 19th century. It becomes more dominant later on as we go. And that is in part, at least as a language. In 1800, you don't see the use of the word white. You see the use of the word savage. There's no real sense yet of whiteness. But as the 19th century progresses and as the United States targets more populations, it talks in terms of whiteness. These are just graphs of white populations. You don't need to note them as much as to note that the government spent a lot of time talking about how many white people, again specifying how many white people were in these states. They did it in Congress too. This is an example of a Homestead Amendment in 1854. Homestead Act doesn't pass until 1862, but in 1854 they're debating it. The dark color is the vote for that the land should only be for whites. I don't put the Senate here because the Senate was unanimous. And these votes are constant in the 1840s. I put this one up because it's the most contested I could find. Most of them were unanimous. Yes, white only. Now, we can talk about, this is a part, again, a debate about slavery as well. But it's not just a debate about slavery. It's a debate about who should get this land, as I mentioned with Oregon earlier. And whites dominate this process, and it extends far more north than the abolitionist slavery divide. So the Homestead Act of 1862 is passed. You see the red states is where it takes place. Note Texas, again, is left out of this process. The Homestead Act settles the West, especially the critical states, North Dakota, South Dakota, some of the biggest battles of the latter period, the Battle of Little Bighorn, for instance, takes place there, and you see the Homestead Act being used very actively and aggressively to settle land. New Mexico is another, Oklahoma is another, and in fact, as I mentioned before, by 1900, the West is importantly incorporated, much of it coming in the 1880s and 90s, and I'm going to then settle here for my final example on Oklahoma and New Mexico, and then we'll conclude. So here are our final three states: Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona. First, Oklahoma. After the Trail of Tears, which by all modern day definitions in international law, it was a genocide. It was the removal of a population to another place. Thousands of people died. At the time, this was an incredibly controversial and dramatic event in American history. It leads to a change in political parties, the breakdown of a government, huge congressional investigations. Again, much like our Vietnam today, of the more modern era, this was a catastrophe. And so Indian Territory was established in 1834, and you see how large it was. Most of the Louisiana Purchase, the exception of some of its most southern boundaries. Over time, that quickly carved away into just what is now the state of Oklahoma. And Indian removal continues throughout the rest of the 19th century, bringing in populations from all over the nation. In 1890, Oklahoma, by this point again, one of three future states that are still territories. Oklahoma by 1890, the population counts put it at a little under 100,000 people. About 80 to 90% Native American. Very few whites lived in Oklahoma because that's Indian Territory. It wasn't open to white settlement. There was constant clamoring to open up Oklahoma. And over a series of really less than 10 years, the darkest spots you see here and the lighter gray adds to it, the United States, parcel by parcel, opened Oklahoma up to homesteading. You might know the Sooners and the gun shooting and the role of these people in covered wagons that raced to land. This, again, is a perfect example of managed settlement, of an overwhelmingly Native American population with white settlers. You set off a gun, and when the gun shoots, the populations run to those territories. The idea of the Sooner, the Oklahoma Sooner, was that if you went before the gun, you didn't get the land, and you never got the land. You were prohibited from ever achieving the land. A perfect use of land management by the federal government. Using small parcels, it rushes lots of people into small places, overwhelms the existing population that is there, has them scatter to other places to just get out of the way, much as we may see in a modern gentrification. A quick rush and a conquering. Oklahoma, more than 1.2 million whites moved to Oklahoma in 10 years. Through the Homestead Act, taking land from the Homestead Act, and Oklahoma became a state. It's a massive example of moving people into a territory. Now, New Mexico is the final one. I'll mention Arizona as a footnote aside. New Mexico was the state or the territory, and I include at this point Arizona, with the largest Mexican and largest indigenous populations that came from Mexico in the war with Mexico. Texas was overwhelmingly white American, even when it first came to the U.S. It never was populated by Mexico. By that I mean 10 to 12,000 Mexicans lived in Texas when Texas declared independence. Far more Americans lived there. California, the gold rush, and also a very small Mexican population that lived in California. But New Mexico was where the Mexican government was most successful in moving populations. New Mexico is also one of the most dangerous places. In 2010, when Barack Obama captured Osama bin Laden, he used the term, it was Code Geronimo. Right, that was the terminology used for the capture of bin Laden. And it's a good, apt term because Geronimo was the 19th century bin Laden. He was out in the frontier, in the hills of Afghanistan / Arizona, New Mexico, where he hid, came out to terrorize, and hid it back. He was seen as a freedom fighter by some, as a terrorist by others. And by the 1880s, he was finally captured and caught. In New Mexico, finally, the Apaches, the Comanche were put at bay, and the United States started to open up homesteading and accomplish more of its goals. Even here in the 1890s and early 1900s, emphatic conversations about what these populations in New Mexico were. Arizona gets carved out of New Mexico at this time because Arizona was always the whitest part of the territory. And Arizona did not want to be part of a broader state with New Mexico. Arizona claiming 95% are Americans, meaning white. the beverage commissions of the time are looking for white people, and it pushed the Homestead Act again to push white population until they're able to bring about statehood, increasing the population, avoiding Mexicans in the process. All right, I know I raced through that, but I want to finish here. Quick set of discussion implications. So when we think of empire, this is what I think of as the American empire, certainly up to the beginning of the 20th century. No doubt we then started a different kind of empire at the beginning of the 20th century with the Philippines, with Cuba, with Puerto Rico, with moving onward and forward into the late 20th and 21st century. But in the 19th century, this is what the United States was about in thinking in terms of empire. Now, I just want to say a couple quick things about this. I'll just mention them and you can ask questions if you're interested. One, if this just seems obvious and interesting, I've got a lot of pages in the book about Mexico because it wasn't obvious to everybody. The United States followed this design. Mexico did it quite differently. Mexico actually gave its power, it was a Tea Party dream. It gave the power to local states outside of the central government. And it let them manage the population settlement and the distribution of land. And it was a disaster. Texas leaves Mexico because there's not a single road that gets to Texas. There's no concentrated development. The populations are scattered across thousands of miles, unable to defend themselves, unable to form some type of concentrated process. Mexicans weren't dumb. They knew this. They talked all about this. They knew the need to secure using land policy, but they had a federated system that relied on state power as opposed to the national government, and they struggled to overcome this huge constraint. Then, after mentioning Mexico, let me just mention a quick caveat. This obviously doesn't explain everything, and Indian removal is a perfect example of that. There were times where the United States military stepped in and it was very violent. But there's something actually quite interesting, and this I think gets then into sort of what this American empire is. This land policy worked in the sense that it was popular. It didn't raise controversy. Indian removal, as I mentioned before, raised huge controversy. Whenever the United States military or the US state used its heavy hand, it tended to, on the one hand, work in a certain way, but also backfire. It was costly. It led to human atrocities, human rights atrocities that led to huge controversies and backlash. Indian removal is one of them. A second that I talk about in the book is the idea of black colonization, moving 4.5 million people out of the country in the 1860s. All of these fail dramatically. When the US government is heavy-handed, it fails. It succeeds much more when it incentivizes and works to manage control in the way that I've discussed. And then finally, let me just say about land policy today. I think where I first got this idea and where I think where we still see this today is zoning and gentrification. It is, again, a hidden management of government activity. We think it's just, hey, people are moving down the street and decided to open up a Whole Foods over there. No, this is government planning, designing to move, often block by block, deciding to say, a few blocks are secure, using private enterprise, using private citizens to move compactly and securely, block by block, taking more until a whole area becomes part of a bigger to-do. So I think there are huge implications here. I could talk about others in the Q&A, but I think that's just one example of how we see this hidden government policy at work. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks very much. I'm looking forward to reading your book, and I appreciate there might be lots of things left out, so I'm going to ask a question about a couple of things. And I should also say that as soon as you've answered it, I have to leave, so it's nothing that you say, whatever your answer is. Okay. And the two things are Comanches and companies, right? So I'm thinking of Texas. The reason why there are Anglo-Americans there is because Mexico invites them in as a buffer against Comanches in the same way that Pennsylvania used Scotch-Irish against Shawnees and Delawares, and the English used Scots against Irish. And not only that, but this idea that the power of the Comanche softens up Mexico,
Right.
and therefore the
Right.
Mexican resistance collapses.
Right.
The other piece I was thinking of was the role of companies, which in some cases are almost adjuncts of the federal government, thinking land companies, the Ohio Company in the 18th century, and then of course Richard Wright's work on railroads in the 19th century. And the idea that these drive expansion, and sometimes the government's actually playing catch-up, or even handmaidens to those.
Right.
So a couple of things that I'm sure you get to in the book, but I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, so on the first, you're right. Pekka Hämäläinen has a great book, Comanche Empire, as well as DeLay, another person. Everything you said about that is absolutely right. The sense that the Comanche softened the population, weakened the ability of the Mexican government to settle that territory. One of the provisions of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is that the United States agrees to defend Mexico from the Comanche and the Apaches as well in that territory. So that's absolutely right. And then the land company is absolutely right as well, that the U.S. government is constantly negotiating with private enterprise to make these deals, and it's managing using these private companies to help them. Often these land companies, kind of in the same way that Halliburton backfires during the Iraq War, when you privatize, you give a contract to someone and then they screw it up. This happens a lot in the 19th century as well. They give these private contracts, and then Indian removal, in the midst of the atrocity, they hire these land companies or these moving companies to move the Cherokee. Some actually, there are no atrocities. They actually do a good job of moving people, and others are a complete disaster, and then they're corrupt and they're brought before Congress and for the scandalous reasons. So there's lots of examples of that, of both sides. And then I'll just say about the railroads. By the time of real railroad expansion, post-Civil War, the United States feels like the hegemon at that point. And it starts to be a little more freewheeling in its willingness to, it starts to step back a bit on the management. Early on, they're very tightly managed. Even Stephen Douglas, who's a big railroader, during this period, he's preventing railroads out to Oregon and Washington in the 1840s and 1850s as part of his role in Congress, because he feared that the British would, if we wait for the railroads, the British were going to swoop in and take the territory. It was still contested territory. Post-1860, no seeming threat, and the railroads, it's like unregulated America. They start to get opportunities, and they go in all sorts of directions. There's corruption. There's there are railroad tracks to seemingly nowhere. So they lighten the load, and you start to see again a part of this American process of deregulation with expansion. So, but yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah.
What are the major reasons why?
Oh yeah, take your mic.
What are the major reasons why we've been, I would argue, so successful and Latin America has not?
Well, that's a huge question that a lot of people, I don't know if I could even, it's a huge question. So there's no real, what would be your sense?
I mean, your arguments, we drove all our natives out of on the reservations.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't.
Yeah, but they had much bigger native populations in those areas. Mexico, I mean, I can just focus on Mexico. Mexico didn't become a nation until 1821, and then immediately was under siege by the U.S. It had, I don't want to get into this because there's so many different features, but it was just a complicated, political process. I would say that I think you can use politics and political circumstances to explain a lot of it. So, yeah, Jeff, pass that back up there.
Hey, thanks for being here. I look forward to reading the book too. I had a similar sort of follow-up question to a Colin. Oh, okay. Similar to Colin's question, I was wondering as you were talking about the sort of top-down versus bottom-up flow of this, and particularly for Indian removal, which in a lot of cases is almost synonymous with territorial expansion. The federal government says it wants it to be orderly and top-down, and Knox and Jefferson talk about the necessary voluntary contracts, but it's like really unclear the extent to which they mean that or they're willing to enforce it. In a lot of cases, it seems that the settlers are driving this. There are local militias that they're basically say, hey, look, we're just going to take this.
Right.
And the federal government comes in to back them up. So I wonder I wonder if that's true or if it's a special case or generally under what conditions the territorial expansion is really is top down as opposed to the federal government following these emerging dynamics on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, so what you say is right in the sense that there's the U.S. government is fighting with settlers as much as they're fighting. They're trying to control these borders, and Knox and Washington and others are constantly fearful of what settlers are doing, not just because of the terrorism that settlers are doing towards Native Americans, but that the Creek, the Cherokee, they're aligned with the Spanish, and they don't want to lead this into a war. Georgia is their big, fearful spot here. The U.S. is much better at managing this in Ohio and in the Northwest, where it's able to carve out than it is in the Southwest. So what I'm able to capture in the book more is the struggle of this, the aspiration and the constant struggle. But one thing I guess where I push back a little is you'll see some will say, well, this was just, these boundaries were meaningless, that the settlers just, ran rampant. And one of the things I try to use with these county maps is to show that they weren't so meaningless. They actually did constrain this settler expansion. The settlers you'll see, when you go through the territorial papers, there's 500 people that are out here deep in Mississippi. There's many more in Kentucky. There are people that get out to Wisconsin very early on. But by and large, the U.S. government keeps them from going, certainly in masses. And you really see a big difference when the U.S. government participates in it. But again, this management is not seamless, and there's elements to where they're putting a finger in a flood, right? Trying to plug a flood, but they do a good job. And I think again, like Oklahoma would be another nice example of that. People are pressing to get into Oklahoma for decades, and the U.S. keeps holding them back. And when you look at census data, there's very few whites that are there. Then they open the floodgates in this managed way, and you get populations there. So I don't want to exaggerate it but because I think those are right, but there's more management here, I think, than has typically met the eye. So, we got two down here. So here and then we'll go over Andrew. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I wanted to invite you to elaborate a little bit on the messiness that you spoke of. That is
the what?
The
The
messiness that is
Uh-huh.
in the book, and more specifically, I'm wondering what role, if any, the U.S. as a plantation economy in the 19th century has in the story you tell. Specifically, I ask this for two reasons. One is anyone who I've been reading Walter Johnson's book River of Dark Dreams lately talks a lot about alternative visions of political economy, and that involves the South being united with Cuba, right, in the 1850s, I believe. And second, just to take your argument into the 20th century, I'm wondering how Hawaii as a plantation economy, does Hawaii fit? Does it fit? Is it in the book? Does it fit your template, or is it different, or is it, because it's the 20th century, it's a different animal? So just.
Yeah. So first thing I'll say, of course, as part of a talk, people like Walter Johnson don't get mentioned, but are heavily cited in the book. I mean, that's a great book that he wrote and very influential. And I play up a lot. He talks about, he has different maps of how the U.S. envisioned itself, especially how the South saw itself. The South saw itself not so much in a relationship with Massachusetts being the United States, but as the Gulf of Mexico with these other places. So in some ways, it's a little bit of a tangent from my story. So to the degree that I talk about the slave plantations, I just kind of piggyback off Johnson, and I don't necessarily critically engage him as much as follow his arguments of the importance there, the different ways in which that slave economy, the cotton economy, affected the South. But it's a bit tangential from my own story. In part two, in the way I did this, again, by focusing on territory to statehood. So it works as a way to manage things. The bad thing is that once something is a state, I'm no longer paying attention. So I'm moving with the territories. And I try to, especially like Louisiana is one where there's a lot going on right at the process. But once it's a state, I kind of leave it. And a lot of what Walter Johnson is talking about is within states that are there. So there's some discussion there of the importance of the slave economy. Louisiana is really important here too because of the role of the French actually in pushing for the slave economy. There's way, and this is nothing that Walter Johnson and others don't say, but slavery was kind of losing some of its steam for a while, and then the French and Louisiana Purchase and the changing economy build it back up. My interest more with slavery comes in two ways. One is the way in which the Civil War ends up pitting the slave states against white settlement in the West. Slave states start to fear that all this new Western territory is going to be anti-slavery. And I mentioned Oregon as an example, but not alone. Many of these Western states are anti-slavery. They're also pro-white, but they're anti-slavery. The South fears that and is trying very hard, ironically, to protect Indian interests in the West so the U.S. won't settle for that. The second is I have a whole chapter on black colonization. In the midst of this white settler nation, there is a constant conversation. Tocqueville is the most famous example of the three races, whites, Native Americans, and Africans. But it's amazing how many people in Congress and publicly talked about these three races. And what they talked about specifically was what would happen when slavery ended? What would happen to this African population? The North, which was a very strong white settler sentiment, wanted black colonization. It's extremely expansive during this time, the idea of Abraham Lincoln being among them. The South opposed colonization because they wanted slavery. So that becomes, in the 1860s, with the Civil War, with the freeing of African slaves, the next big issue of what to do with 4.5 million Africans for this white settler state. So that's a roundabout way of getting at that. And Hawaii, I'll mention, I talk about Hawaii in the concluding chapter. And Hawaii, yes, like many of these places, also plantation economy, sugar, pineapple, and so forth. But Hawaii, there's some similar dynamics. Of all the places, so Hawaii is being grabbed at a time when the Philippines and Cuba again, and Dominican Republic and other places are being looked at. Hawaii was the place that state officials thought they could move settlers, white settlers, and overwhelm the population. And it's actually really fascinating with Hawaii. Hawaii becomes a state within days of being a majority white population. And actually not majority, a plurality white population. So they kind of rush Hawaii a little bit because the Japanese are moving to Hawaii. But the logic is exactly the same. They keep saying over and over, we can settle Hawaii with white settlers. Whites will go to Hawaii. They talk about Cuba, and especially the Philippines, and they say there's no way. Whites will not move to the Philippines, so we don't want it. And with Cuba, similar conversations that occur over. Again, I'm going way too fast, but that there's a similar dynamic there with Hawaii and Alaska that fit the others. Andrew.
Yeah, so you mentioned land management, and we talked about railroads as well, but excluding them, I mean, what was the federal government's commitment in terms of public works or other things that we associated with the federal government? Mm-hmm. So, for example, the Morrill Act is passed in the same year as the Homestead Act, and so that sort of brought in education. A federal judiciary would also be important to displace sort of that local justice of the peace sort of dispensation that was occurring. So if you could comment on that, how important was that? How much did it lag land policy? That'd be interesting for me.
Yeah, so all of that is there, and part of this book, to have any focus and ability to do is I try to focus on land policy. But I say frequently throughout, there's other, the government is doing other things. As I mentioned also in the territories, they're dominating the economic expansion of the area. So the college land grants is interesting. So yeah, in 1862, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, and the railroads all come, right, with the Democrats of the South who are resisting expansion drop out, And the Republicans, pass these huge policies, and they also incorporate the West to give the Senate and the House more seats to push the Republican agenda. One of the interesting things with land grants for colleges is that they did see, they looked at Wisconsin with 40% German citizens in it. They looked at South Dakota, which is getting a lot of Northern Europeans. They wanted a way to indoctrinate or make Americans, and so it was very important to have the University of Minnesota, the University of Iowa, and so forth, these big land grants to be part of the process. And that's when they are distributing land, they require universities to be a part of that land distribution. It's a really critical part. Others have made this argument, but I think that's a big piece. Was there another component there? Was that, yeah. So it's absolutely right, and there's a lot of time there's spent on canals, roads. The postal service is really important here. So I'm not disagreeing with any of those. I'm trying to bring out one that I think has been overlooked a bit. But, yeah. Back there.
I'm Bill Fischel. I'm in the economics department, but I'm interested in land policy.
Mm-hmm.
You made an analogy to modern zoning as if this was something the government was pushing on cities.
No,
I would insist
yeah.
that it's almost entirely bottom up. I have a book called Zoning Rules that makes that in chapter 2 that the federal government has almost no role. In fact, the states almost have no role. It's really very much
But the
local.
cities do. Yeah, but there's still
Cities do.
there's
Yes,
a public role.
absolutely.
That's all I meant by that. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry about
The other point I'd make is the role of schools. The land grant colleges were perhaps, I won't make a strong argument here, but perhaps an extension of the land grants for just public schools. The 16th section of every square mile, which was dedicated, was an endowment for schools. And that, I think, I'm channeling early 20th century historians on this, was almost entirely a way of inducing settlers to go out into the West. And it was largely borrowed from the New England model of you settle in Hanover or Norwich, Vermont, and you'll get land to help finance a school. I'm not quite sure that this contradicts anything you've said here, because it is indeed a federal policy that's adopted as a proven policy, but it's also very much a bottom-up. This is what we want. This is what the settlers want. The Ohio Company virtually writes the Northwest, the Land Act of 1785. So you might think a little more about that process. I'll make one little amendment too. Sorry, completely different. You have a young colleague in the history department at Princeton named Rob Carl.
Right,
who
just came out with a book. Yeah.
Okay, just came out. We talked about it up here. He was a Dartmouth guy, whom I know. And I asked him the question of what was going on with the land policy in Columbia. Didn't they lay it out when the settlers went out into the territories? The answer was no, and that was a large part of their problem. So you had Colombians fighting Colombians.
Right.
Not so much. It wasn't so much the indigenous peoples that were upset by that. So this policy that we had, I find it interesting that you draw it up as, which I'd not really. I mean, I'd heard of it, but not heard it emphasized, as a way of keeping away other people. Putting in the white Americans was also a way of keeping white Americans from battling each other.
Right.
Because they laid it out in grids and said, this is thine and this is mine.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole legal purpose, too, of it's easy to then, because you have all these lawsuits where people are trying to figure who owns the land. And so the government is stepping in, and part of the grid is that it's easy to identify where land begins and ends. In the book you mentioned, I mean, that came out in November, and I was reading it eagerly, but I was in page proof, so it was hard. But Yeah, so that's all absolutely right. Just a reminder, yeah, when I mentioned the zoning thing, what I meant is that public policy, but the federal government has played a very, very different role in the 20th century on land than it did in the 19th century. It was this is all based on territories, so so that was just a quick example. That's actually not in my book either, so I just used it here. But as far as the issue with universities and schooling, I mean, it's interesting. I don't disagree with what you say, but so most of the archival work I did is at the government level. And so, you talk about the bottom up, and I read a lot of these conversations, the land ordinances and the purposes of having these. And it's not a big part of the book in any way, one way or the other. But so it's interesting that the inducement part, I read a lot about people looking for inducements. How do we get people out here? In fact, there's a lot of travel guides and trying to reach out to different countries and get people to come there. I didn't see that much of this, but it's not that I didn't see the opposite. But I did see a bit of, and there's also is it Beth Saylor? Is that her name? She just wrote a recent book about this. Historian. I did see the arguments that there were fears. Kentucky really was central to their thinking of the problem of expansion. Kentucky was always seen as a bad example, and they feared what people were doing, that they feared Kentucky might leave the U.S., they feared that they were reckless and they had these terrible land policies and they were corrupt and so forth. And that seemed to, the Northwest Ordinance was set up again to kind of do the opposite, to make it very organized, but also to make sure that these populations that weren't American were learning to become Americans. So that's what I saw a lot of the examples of. It's not a counter, but and it's interesting that these alternatives. I think I just didn't necessarily look at those same documents, but I think that's all a part of a piece here. And I don't want to deny. I guess this is the final thing. I don't want to deny the bottom-up piece of this either. In part, I'm pushing against an extensive story of a bottom-up story, and I'm trying to highlight a much more managed central role from the government. But I don't want to make this overly dramatic and strip away what really was, in many ways, I mean, to use in a different term, but like the middle ground type of dynamic, that the government is participating in this process, trying to manage this in a way. So. Yeah.
Did either Mexico or Canada manage expansion the way the U.S. did?
I wanted to get into Canada because a bunch of people have told me that Canada did, that they had their own kind of Western Homesteading Act and so forth. And I read a little bit about it, but it was too much to get into an undertaking. Mexico tries. I spend more time with Mexico, and Mexico is trying, but they're fighting. They don't declare independence till 1821. They have a lot of instability in their early years. They do a lot of the same things the U.S. tries to do with less success, but partly it's because when Mexico, from its birth of 1821, Mexico values state rights even more than we did, and they weren't able to really overcome that in the same way. Their constitutions continually emphasize these state rights, and so they struggled not just in Texas, California, New Mexico, but Guatemala, on their southern borders as well. They struggled to keep this territory. Unlike the United States, this gets to maybe your question about one of the differences between the U.S. and a place like Mexico. Mexico had massive borders that it immediately tried to defend. The United States started with pretty narrow borders, and so it was able to defend those borders a little more manageably. And interestingly, again, like as I mentioned in the talk, when Jefferson is able to acquire the Louisiana Purchase, his first act is to say, we're not going to do anything with it. We're going to kind of keep it away because we can't defend it. So we're going to keep ourselves smaller. Mexico, right from the start, is struggling with way too big a territory, and so they really battle to deal with this. I'll say as well here, as a final thing, when the United States, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States very carefully designs how much of Mexico it takes, and it takes more than half of Mexico's land mass, but less than 1% of its population. And that tells you, one, how much the U.S. is thinking about population, but two, how much of Mexico's population was far to the south, as opposed, so they really struggled to settle these big borders. So. Up there. Yeah.
Maybe being from the other side of the river here, I'm a little sensitive to giving Texas,
Does that mean Vermont?
Vermont, giving them total credit for being the only one of doing anything. Vermont voluntarily ceded sovereignty in 1791 after 14 years as a republic. So I think we can put ourselves in the category with Texas.
Oh, Texas didn't give up anything. They kept everything they had.
They sure did.
I mean, there was, this is something we don't celebrate enough, is what Vermont did, what Virginia did especially. So many states gave up land claims. That's what created the public domain, is that these states agreed to do this. Virginia being the most important because it was the most powerful and kind of set by example. But the one that really refused all the way to the very end was Georgia. Georgia fought giving up its land claims, and it's partly what leads to, or a big part of what leads to, the Trail of Tears, is that the U.S. is trying to resolve with Georgia its land claims. But it's actually a quite, especially in today's context of all sides fighting, for their own interests, it's a quite generous moment of many different places in the United States giving up territory on behalf of a nation. A nation that is just getting started, that has no real, people are still kind of envisioning what it means. So there's something to that. You're going to disagree?
Quid pro quo, they took on the debt.
Well, they took on the debt, yes. No, right, yes. But it's still, I mean, and they use that land, in part for that. Yeah. No, that's right, yeah. But still, I don't know. It just seems, I will say, and now I'm going to blank on the name of the article. One of the very first pieces I read was a piece by economists about this idea. It was like a 15-page article, but the theme of using homesteading to conquer the West. I think that's the title of it. It's in the book. I'm just blanking on the Anderson. So it was a really just. I mean, he captured really well what this dynamic is. I fill in a lot of details, but it's a nice piece there. All right, great, thank you. Thank you.